Good evening all and welcome. Before the video begins, I would like to make it abundantly clear that the stories presented tonight are not true. Now before you jump ship, as some of you might be inclined to do, hear me out for a moment. For the last year and a half, I have been procuring some exceptionally good creepypasta type stories, which I believe are really something special. It's taken some time to put it together, but with the team, I have finally managed to put out some of these fantastic stories that I would really love to share with you. Not to mention the video is exceptionally long. So, if you give me a chance, and my friend Deadly Cure over here, I'm sure you'll be left sufficiently impressed and spooked. So, hopefully, I'll see you at the end. But for now, stay comfortable and let the darkness take control. It was supposed to be an easy job. Walk in, grab anything that looked like it could sell, and walk out. I guess you could say that I'm a sort of repo man. Clients call me, give me the address and what they want, and if the item is in satisfactory condition when I get it, I give it back to them, and they fork over the cash. Most of the time I can pull for anything else I take a fancy to, but sometimes people want a discreet job. Grab whatever they want, leave anything else. For those jobs I charge a lot more, and this was one of them. 6 a.m. I walked into the rendezvous point, a small Starbucks tucked away in a street corner. 15 minutes later, a client walks in. Old guy, balding, a sort of dead look in his grey-blue eyes. He had bags under his eyes like he hadn't slept in quite a while. Probably why I was in a Starbucks, and not an alley downtown like usual. "So, the job?" I ask. He awkwardly sat down. "Straight to business then?" He raised his eyebrow. "Most hustlers flaunt a bit beforehand. Get the clients riled up, you know." He's done this before then. No room for haggling. "I'm not here to show off my junk. This is work, not the strip club." He laughed. Sounded like the guy had 15 different assortments of cancer. "Right then. The job's an apartment in the city, shady place. It's called the Yorkers Brewery. Apartment number? You'll be looking for apartment B5, 3rd floor. He's the only one currently occupying the building aside from the landlord. The others moved out due to noise complaints. And what am I looking for? A little black gem. I think the guy keeps it in his hallway somewhere. Don't bring it back to me though. I don't have any use for it, nor do I want it. You can keep it if you like. I just need it out of his little apartment." He took a pause, breathed heavily, and exploded into a series of coughs. I took a day out to scout the place and find a way to get in. I drove around until I found the place, and it was the ugliest thing I'd seen in my life. The outside wall was covered in graffiti and the sign was barely legible. I could tell without getting out of the car that I wouldn't be able to go in from the front door. There was no way I was making my way up the stairs without the landlord confronting me. A man walked out the building. He wore a navy blue hoodie and sweatpants and was walking stiffly, as if he were dying from a terminal illness or something. I got out the car and walked around the building. At the back was a rusty metal fire escape that ran down the back of the building like a decaying spinal cord. There was my way in. I would climb up the stairs, climb in through the window and ransack the place. The only problem was I didn't know which room was which. Climbing up the stairs to the 3rd floor, I peered in through the first window. I could faintly see through the dirt-caked glass the letters B1 in faded copper on the back of the front door. Going horizontally, I was able to find B5. My way in was covered. All I had to do now was break in tomorrow night. My breaking kit was fairly minimal. Black outfit with a black hoodie and a burlap sack I found to transport the goods. A few lockpicks and a baseball bat for protection. Most of you are probably calling me a scumbag and a subspecies of Homo erectus, but it was either stealing stuff from people or the homeless shelter. I was back at the Yorker Brewery again. I climbed up the staircase, avoided the steps that I remembered buckled and creaked under my weight, and reached the window and fit my fingers underneath the tiny cracks. I was going to try and bust the lock open. It usually worked with windows like these. I pushed with all my strength and nearly fell inside. The Muppet left his window unlocked. I ducked in through the window and found myself in his living room. It was empty, except a sofa and a CRT television. My eyes widened, and I took out my baseball bat as I saw a figure in the corner hidden by the shadows. We stared at each other for a minute. Then I realized it was just a mannequin. Turned to face the window, I entered. It was made of a shiny plastic and completely black. What do you need a mannequin in your living room for? To my right was a hallway with 2 doors on either side. At the end of the hallway was a squat little nightstand, and on top of it, out in the open, was the gem. Little was an understatement. This thing was almost as big as my fist. Bent low, I progressed through the hallway. I reached one door and put my ear to it. Nothing. I did the same with the next one. The owner was in there snoring and coughing loudly in his sleep. Another 5 minutes. I was ducking out the window with the gem in my sack. Even though it was bigger than I had expected, it still weighed more than it let on. It would be going somewhere safe in my house until I could find a buyer. The next morning I was back at the Starbucks. The old man walked inside and handed me the cash and sat down with me to talk about the job. "Everything went well?" he asked. "Yeah, man. Walked in, walked out, took the gem." Good. Where did you find it?" The guy looked at me dead in the eye. He looked healthier, as if he were getting more sleep than before. "Guy left it out in the open, right in the hallway, exactly like you said. He even left the window open. I couldn't believe it." He chuckled. He got up, laid his hand on my shoulder. "Well, thank you, son. You did me a mighty favor. Take care of yourself, all right?" I walked out the Starbucks with more than $1,000 in my pocket, as well as the gem back at my place. The guy even bought me a coffee. As I finished the last of it off, I got back into the car. The next night I got into bed and turned the light off. I was in a trance-like state for about 15 minutes before I was jolted awake by a shrill, continuous beep, like the aftermath of an explosion right beside your ear. I looked around my bedroom for the source, but I climbed back into bed empty-handed and tried to sleep, which I managed at 1 a.m. The next few nights the noise increased steadily in volume, until on the 3rd night I could identify it. It sounded like a young girl screaming. Just screaming. Forever. It got worse from then. Every night the sound would be there, looming over me, sending stabs of pain into my head. On the 10th night the sound was so loud it sounded like it was coming from right beside my ear. I turned over to look. 10 seconds later I was locking my room from the outside. It was the mannequin from the apartment. It had been stooping over me, peering into my eyes. There was a huge gaping depression where his mouth should have been. The next 5 minutes I stood outside my room hyperventilating. The thing, still screaming, had begun to thump violently on my door, so hard that it rattled its hinges. I didn't know what to do. I buried my face in my hands until I remembered the gem. I dashed downstairs into the basement to get to my vault, entered the code and snatched it, and then, half naked, ran outside and into my car. The thing had stopped thumping and sounded much closer. It had gotten out. I drove like the wind, crossing red lights, charging down one-way streets, the wrong way until I got to the river. I parked close to the edge, took one final look at the fist-sized gem in my hand and chucked it out the window, and didn't drive away until I heard a very satisfying splash. When I got back to my house, the thing was gone, and the bedroom door had been thrown clean off its hinges. The last 3 nights have been utter bliss, 3 full nights of rest. This morning I woke up feeling elated. I got up into a sitting position and froze. At the foot of my bed, arms outstretched and mouth wide open, making no sound, was the mannequin. At my feet lay the black gem. I tried to break it. I've tried to lose it in different places. I even drove across 3 states to get rid of it. Nothing works. It just delays it. It appears the only way to get rid of it is to have someone else take it. Please, if anything looks too good to be true, be cautious, especially if it's breaking into someone's house, because you never know what might break out with you. I need sleep.
I consider myself to be fairly modern as priests go. God's power manifests in minor transcendental ways, and most matters of the earth really are of the earth. My parish is a little out of the way, just a few hundred people clustered around a minor cattle industry. Being the kind of priest I am, and having the sort of superstitious, old-fashioned flock I did, there were a few occasions where I acted as a voice of reason and secular empiricism when rumours started to circulate. When Pat Mahan half joked he was seeing fairies in his garden at night, just like his old grandmother had always talked about, it was me who pressed him to head into town and get himself seen to, leading him being diagnosed with a shot optic nerve that sent white lights flickering across his vision in the dark. I'd venture to say I was a gentle, restraining force, reminding people how rarely their ills can be linked back to the spiritual or darkly divine. This is why I was truly, genuinely surprised to find that Molly really was possessed. I knew something was wrong when her panicked mother let me into her room and I found her completely naked and sitting in front of her dresser. She had become so thin to the point that her limbs were gangly and insect-like. Her skin was solid grey, not like she was dying, but like she was dead. She didn't give any sign that she noticed my entrance. The room was destroyed, littered with broken perfume bottles, torn clothes, and anything you might find in a teenage girl's room, bent, broken, or shattered. She was perfectly still, looking straight ahead. I thought she must be enraptured by her own reflection until I noticed that the dresser mirror had been shattered. "Molly?" I asked, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. I forced myself to inch forwards towards her, reaching out my hand. My finger tipped her bony shoulder, and there was an explosion of movement that made me throw myself back against the wall. When I collected myself, I saw that Molly was coiled, squatting in the corner of the room. One of the corners where the walls met the ceiling. Molly squeezed into it like a frog in defiance of gravity, her face now pulled back in a rabid grimace as she hyperventilated through clenched teeth. I froze, pinned back against the far wall like a rabbit in front of a wolf. I don't know how long I was there, locked in place by the age-old instinct that when you move, the predator pounces. That endless purgatory was eventually interrupted by a deep, echoing voice that spilled out of Molly, despite her mouth remaining closed. A flood of a voice that suffocated the entire room. "Stop thinking about Christ." I began to breathe faster. "Stop thinking about Christ," came the voice again. Why?" I said. "He is hope. He is salvation. He is what you would term goodness. Thoughts like that are an irritant to my kind. Never mind that the fiction of him was created to cope with the reality of us. What he embodies is toxic to my kin." It was hard to reconcile the calmness and intelligence of the voice with the frothing, hanging beast that had once been Molly. "What do you want?" I asked. "I want to hurt Molly, and I'm doing a good job." As much as this terrified me, It put the matter in no uncertain terms. I wasn't a good priest if I left. I wasn't anything I like to think I am. I reached for the crucifix hanging on a chain around my neck and pushed it outwards towards Molly. There was a sound like stabbed cat, and I was rocketed back, slamming against the wall so hard plaster rained down on me. I slid up off my feet, a colossal force pressing against and around my neck, something grasping my wrist with the strength of an ape. My eyes flickered open, and the blurring cleared until I could see Molly below me, looking up with crazed, furious eyes. Her eyes darted over to the crucifix, still clenched in my hand. "You think that will help you save Molly? Let's see." She grabbed the cross from my palm. I heard a wet sizzling, and a veil of steam started enveloping her hand. She held the cross between her two fingers and began dragging them across her face, leaving red, bubbling streaks on her lifeless flesh. "It's working, see? See how you're saving Molly?" "Stop. Stop, please stop," I screamed, before being thrown across the floor in a whacking, painful slide. A moment later, the cross clattered across the floor beside me, still steaming, deformed and melted. The moments after that are a frantic blur, but they ended with me collapsing out of the room and slamming the door closed behind me. I stood up, leaning against the wall for support, to see Molly's mother bawling at the far end of the hall. I looked down and saw my hands, clenched into half claws and shaking uncontrollably. "The Lord is with us all," I said in a shaking voice. "But I think I'm going to need to contact some people who the Lord is more with, a lot more with." I had to wait a while in my sitting room. I had called the bishop, and he said he'd call someone else, and I was waiting on the result from all that. My house was fairly standard for priest accommodations. Cozy, warm, wood-panelled. Kojak, the fit German shepherd I had inherited from the previous priest, was panting anxiously at my feet, looking concerned. I indulged a bad habit that I had slipped into, sticking my fingers in the whiskey I was drinking to let Kojak lick it off. Not enough to affect him, of course. He just seemed to like the taste. I looked at the table in front of my seat, and my eyes were drawn to the thin glass globe near its edge. The oceans fully transparent, the continents frosted. It looked very different than it had that morning, bigger, less easily contained in my head, every tiny spot more mysterious than before. The phone rang and pulled me out of my thoughts. I answered straight away, desperate for some guidance. There were no introductions. The voice at the other end got straight into it. "We will arrive at Molly O'Neill's house in 1 hour. We will require your assistance and total cooperation by order of the Holy See. Please be there." I was standing outside of the gate to Molly's house when the van pulled up. Not a limousine, not some fancy gleaming black affair with a chrome grille. It was a rusting white van that, now that I think of it, they had probably bought second-hand in the previous half an hour, so it couldn't be traced. The men who stepped out, however, looked about how I'd expect, serious, stern, wearing the long frock-like priest clothes that I'd always thought would be more alienating than the black pants and shirt I wore. They stopped in front of me, silent for a second, as they looked me over with squinting hard eyes. A series of crashes sounded from the window to Molly's bedroom, and we all saw a sharp elbow smash through the glass before being instantly sucked back in like paper through an aeroplane door. They stiffened their backs slightly, looking at the cavity. "This looks like it constitutes a severe case," said one. A man in his 50s, with well-combed orange hair. "Very severe," said the other, a younger man with thick black hair and a strong build. His face less lined, but just as serious. "What do we have to do?" I asked. They both looked at me, like it had been my turn to speak. "In case of genuine possession, we have very strict system of dealing with the vessels. Just cooperate with us every step of the way," said the older one. "Vessels?" "We have to move it. As you may have already learned, judging by those bruises around your neck and the shakes, you haven't quite settled. Transporting something like this is no easy feat." Just as he said this, 2 more of Molly's limbs, and I would never be sure which 2, burst out of the window, flailing and spinning fast enough to blur, before whipping back inside, with the scritch of the glass dragged with them from the edges of the holes. The younger priest wrapped his hand against the side of the van, and a dozen more figures spilled out, spreading themselves into a wide, staggered line and aiming lightweight machine guns at Molly's house. Machine guns that had ornate crosses in the place of sights. Molly's house was far enough up the road and away from the village that I don't think anybody saw. It was probably something the priests had made plans to prevent in any case. The figures were all dressed in shells of black, plastic-like body armor, their faces concealed by visored helmets and grilled breathing slots. No skin whatsoever was visible, their only identifying mark on their left shoulder plates. It was a gaudy, colourful quartet of boxes centred on a smaller green and gold crest, the boxes ranging from displaying simple striped designs to complex, hard-to-interpret tangles of objects and symbols. After a moment, and yes, it shouldn't have taken that long, I realised it was the symbol of the Swiss Guard. "They actually do something," I said. The 2 priests had withdrawn the most hefty, overworked crucifixes I had ever seen in person. They were solid steel, only capable of being held in a full grasp, worked over in pearls and ivory, and several other obviously expensive white substances I couldn't be bothered to identify. They stormed in towards the house, crosses already held out in front of them. The guard followed, following after the striding priests automatically. It was in those last few seconds that I noticed something particularly troubling. One of the guards was not carrying a gun, but a thick silver collar at the end of an extendable pole. Its outside edge covered in skinny jeweled bars, some stuck flat against the surface, other smaller ones sticking out on tiny hinges. It looked like the kind of thing you'd use to restrain a rabid dog. 10 minutes later, we were all sitting on bare iron benches in the bleak interior of the van. I was pressed between 2 of the guards, dense plates pressing in on me. Molly's capture and extraction had been loud, chaotic, and had required no small amount of reassurance of Molly's mother by me that it was for the best and that her daughter would be fine. She was now at the opposite end of the passengers area, towards the driver's compartment, pinned to the corner by the outstretched crosses of the priests and the aimed cross sights of a few of the guards. The dog catcher analog had been closed around her neck, held from a distance by another one of the guards. She moaned and squealed pitifully in what I judged to be fear and pain. Twice she attempted to leap forward towards the door, but each time the guard with the dog catcher would press a button on the pole. The smaller hinged bars on the collar would snap down over the larger one, forming crosses. Waves of steam and smoke would cascade out over the silver as the smell and sound of sizzling meat swelled. Her throat would bubble and blister, crumple and boil down to a red swamp before she would instantly collapse back to where she had been, screaming, before the crosses were parted and the sizzling subsided. In the aftermath, she would moan and squeal even more than she had before. How did your crosses stop her? Mine didn't. The two priests looked back at me. The older one answered, "Yours was probably made in a warehouse in Mongolia, where child labourers try not to burn themselves with molten steel. These ones have been blessed by every pope of the last 400 years, in full view of at least 12 archbishops, and then paraded in view of the faithful. They are of a higher and meticulously tended class of holiness." "Your children," came Molly's voice. It wasn't the overbearing voice that had previously come from Molly. It was a weak, crackling sound spoken with her mouth. The words were saturated with pain, screechy and drawn out. "You idiots. It's not holy. It's all your delusion being dumped onto those objects. All your hope and desperation and love, ideas about salvation, and the arrogance of thinking that it's all on your side, and the universe was made by a kind, gilding old man. You dump it onto the Pope, like a waterfall of acid, and he soaks it up and dumps it onto those crosses. Only because people believe he can, because they give him permission to channel their poison. He dumps it, and he's helped out by all the archbishops you called them, and all those people at your parades and visits. So many people caught in the tamest level of hell and hoping for better. All their thoughts, unnatural thoughts, thoughts that can only exist in the epiderm. They get sprayed out and shower those crosses." The pain in the voice started to fade away, replaced by growing malice. "You think that means you're right? About God? About Christ? About divinity? But you're wrong. It's proof of how wrong those notions are. That the existence of them, their mere presence, is so scalding and wrong and impossible that it's death to us, to almost all life. Those ideas are eldritch and incomprehensible to anyone from the outside of the cold world of the epiderm. They are aberrations, warped perversions, possible only in your dark silver of the universe. Perhaps I do not explain well enough. The universe is..." The screaming came again. The guard handling the dog catcher had triggered it, standing up out of his seat. "Shut up," he bellowed. "Shut up, you monster! Monster!" I tried to stand up and stop him, but was pulled back down by the guards beside me. A moment later, I saw the younger priest surge forward, sending the hysteric guard's armoured head clanging into the iron wall with his elbow, before wrenching the pole from his hands and releasing the hinges. Another guard rose to drag the now dazed man back away from Molly, still pinned down by the older priest's outstretched cross. "Do not speak to the aberration," said the younger priest. "Speak again, and we burn you to the bone." "Over my dead body," I shouted from behind. Several guns snapped up to aim at me, and the old priest met my gaze. It quickly became apparent that my dead body was not as much of a moral obstacle as I thought it was. After another hour, the van slowed down, stopping a few times and picking up a little speed before stopping one final time. The older priest led me and most of the guards from the dim interior into washed-out daylight. We were on a windy concrete landing field, about 20 feet from a plane. The guards spread out, creating an aisle. Molly was carried by two guards, wrapped in a brown sheet of canvas. The young priest still held onto the pole that stuck out of the sheet's tattered folds. She began to shake and convulse in their struggling grips, before the young priest flicked the collar switch on and off a few times, eliciting muffled screams from behind the ball gag they'd put on Molly, sending her into one last massive spasm that almost lifted the guards off their feet before she went limp again. They recovered themselves and jogged quickly up to the unfolded stairs onto the plane. We were soon in the air. I had been instructed to sit in the forward passenger compartment. I had caught a glimpse of the section behind as they carried Molly through, a bare metal hangar, like a larger version of the cold back of the van. I was there for a long time, not liking the sounds I could hear coming from behind me. Eventually, they subsided. I felt alone in the forward compartment. The only other person was a Swiss guard, standing stiffly to attention and refusing to answer my questions. A dusty whispering built up in my head, barely perceptible at first, but intensifying until it was louder than the howling of the aircraft engines. The guard gave no indication of hearing anything.
"You're nervous, little liar,"
came a voice like an animal scratching across dead leaves. I must have startled because the Swiss guard standing off to the side looked at me and asked, in a voice made distant by the rushing whispers that slid through my skull, if I was experiencing anything unusual. I instinctually said no, and the guard reluctantly turned away from me.
"Skittish, pliant, toothless, not even the spine or conviction to be a good carrier of the plague they filled you with."
The only way I could imagine responding was with my own thought. Hello? Hello, is this you? Is this the demon?
Molly O'Neill, the real, original Molly O'Neill, is a little ball of pain and fear in the palm of my hand, coiling and wriggling and pissing herself. I know what she knows. I remember what she remembers. And I know what she thought of you. As she saw it, nobody your age becomes a priest nowadays, not unless they're running from something.
Just let her go. She's innocent. She did nothing to deserve this.
You believe that things should happen to beings based on whether you like what they did previously? I wasn't lied to. The creatures of the epiderm are bizarre things.
What's the epiderm?
What's hell?
That's where you're from.
It's what you call the place I come from. The epiderm is what I call the place you come from. Aren't you not meant to respond to me? Gird your soul against the darkness and all that?
I can't say I took his advice, so much as I couldn't think of anything to say, so silence took over. Why me? Why is it me you're talking to?
You're the most interesting, at least on the inside. You're the one with the least belief. Everyone else, their faith is a burning inferno. Yours is a numb, passionless mass right at the base of your mind. They're all sure of themselves, sure of who they are and what they're for. But you're so lost and filled with repressed doubt that you'd have a pleasant little conversation with a demon on your way to an exorcism. I don't blame you. They're not doing much to make you feel part of the team. Have they even told you where we're going?
You're wrong. I swore an oath to serve Jesus Christ in all my thoughts and actions. I did not take it lightly, and it's not a decision for which I feel doubt. There was a brief lull where I fancied for a moment that I had put the beast in its place. Then, in an instant, curiosity and dread defeated me. Where are we going? Cruel, dry laughter swept through my mind.
The big city.
What followed was the plane coming down in an empty landing field. the bundling and forcing of Molly into another black van in much better repair than the last, and an hour's driving. After a short time, the van slowed to a crawl. After another few minutes, it stopped completely. The van doors were opened from the outside by more of the armoured Swiss guard. There was far less secrecy and concealment now. The guards dragged me out of the vehicle with them, and the final guard dragged Molly out last, flanked by the two priests. I looked around, finding myself in a lifeless, cobbled plaza, flanked on all sides by a multi-tiered stone building, carved into sinuous, flowing lines, curving around windows that flared elegantly at each end. "Where are we?" I asked. "It's off the tourist trail," said the older priest, still looming over Molly's pitiful, crawling form with his gaudy cross. But I would have thought that any priest could be trusted to know when they're in the Vatican. We entered the building, now surrounded by at least 20 of the black-armoured Swiss guard. The hallways were carved stone, just like the outside, with arched ceilings and black-tiled floors. The only sounds were our wave of footsteps and the echoing, wretched shrieks of Molly as she was dragged across the floor by a guard. I walked beside the young priest. There seems to be some gap between the personality of the demon and how Molly is acting, I said, speaking up to be heard over Molly's desperate, unintelligible protests. The demon is usually calm enough, or so it seems to me, but she's always screaming. The young priest looked at me across his shoulder, acknowledging me for the first time in a long time. The mechanics of possession are not fully understood. As far as we know, the emotions of the victim can come through in physical behavior, while the demon has some sort of override control. The demon can make anything happen, but the soul of the victim, which is experiencing great torment, will often retain physical control on a moment-to-moment basis, regularly including an ability to do things they wouldn't have previously been able to, both by co-opting demonic power and making use of physical alterations to the body, wrought either consciously or unconsciously by the entity. So regretfully, a lot of that pain we're hearing, possibly the large majority of it, is her pain. That sounds like something straight out of a textbook. The priest kept striding forward, looking dead ahead. There isn't a textbook, is there? Was that from a textbook? The priest continued to look ahead. My God, have you ever done this before? He didn't answer for a few seconds before finally deciding not to ignore me. He has, he said, nodding curtly across the hallway towards the other priest. A lot? Once. I became dizzy for a second, suddenly feeling whatever slight sense of security I'd had being snatched out from under me. Was it successful? Yes. So the victim, they survived? No. I didn't ask any more questions after that. We started descending a shadowy stairway, emerging into an underground library, dusty and filled with ancient leather books. The only light came from the flickering yellow wall lamps, shell-like in shape and providing nowhere near enough light to read. Each compartment and section of the library was separated by brass grills that the guards yanked roughly aside with a scraping, metallic sound, like they were fighting against a lot of rust and disrepair. We descended another stairwell and passed through another level of libraries, these ones containing books that were more tattered and frayed, the air sterile, and shattered wall lights cold and dark. Beneath that level, there were no more open spaces. Lit by torches slung underneath the Swiss guards' guns, we descended into a warren of arched tunnels made of ancient stone blocks, cracked and bulging out at odd angles. As we progressed, I began to hear something over the ululating echoes of Molly's screams, similar enough that it could have been there a long time without me noticing. It was deeper, with a gnarling, throaty quality, and where Molly sounded like a monstrous parody of a teenage girl being tormented, this sounded like a similar corruption of 10,000 people suffering and despairing as one, like the synchronized slaughter of 1,000,000 cancer-ridden cattle. It was still distant now, but I slowed down a moment as I had to wonder, would I be able to tolerate that sound if it got any louder? It felt like if that happened, if, God forbid, it came to be as loud and as close as Molly was then, my soul might flee my body just to get away from it. The older priest seemed to notice this, crossing across the hallway to clasp my shoulder, both to comfort me and make sure I kept walking. I know what you're feeling, my brother in Christ. We all feel it. But if you'll look at your training and studies, I believe you will remember that even the valley of death has its saving graces. Thank you, I'll bear that in mind, I mumbled, trying to compose myself. I decided he needn't know that I only remembered that passage from Pulp Fiction. In any case, it was hard to fully appreciate the gesture, while I was watching a girl that I had known and watched over for years, as she was dragged naked and screaming through what looked like to be a medieval torture dungeon. We began to pass rusty iron doors inset in the walls. We kept walking for a long time, the older priest's firm grip keeping me moving. The distant sound got louder and louder. I thanked God for every lull before physically shaking as a new wave of howling crashed down the stone corridors. After what felt like an endless march, the 1,000 voices had become so loud that they drowned Molly out. My knees had become weak and shaky, my body drenched with sweat as my heart hammered at triple pace against my chest. And all in an instant, it cut off. The howling collapsed into perfect silence. The older priest raised a hand and the holy convoy froze, moving into defensive positions. I saw that we were in a hallway that led down a single door to its end, identical to every other door we had passed in the maze of tunnels. The older priest turned to me. If we need your help, it will be soon. You need to understand what we are doing here. I forced myself to nod, still recovering from the howling, still afraid of it returning. Exorcisms do not work as you imagine. You can't just force out a demon and expect it to tumble back down to hell. You've just forced it out and left it with free rein to possess anyone and everyone. That's why we developed a system. A system? In France, sometime in the early 16th century, there was an incident completely unprecedented in our records. A number of demons, 5 we think, entered the world around the same area, and by chance or coordination possessed the same person. The results were abominable. Several villages were destroyed before we managed to suppress it and transport it here. This was unbelievable. Back then and now, possession was very rare. The church had a long policy of incarcerating victims, and still had only a handful in custody at any given time. So what we had was one person already suffering and the 5 of the fallen. Somebody made a proposal that must have seemed as insane then as it does now, but it was attempted. Force the spirits from one vessel into another. Force them out as we had, but not into the world, into another vessel. I leaned against the wall, my throat tightening as I began to understand the context for the sound I'd been hearing, making it so much worse. It worked. The possessed did not survive most of the time. If they did, they rarely lived well, but it could at least put them out of their misery, pile all of it onto one, and make these spirits easier to monitor by centralizing them. It meant we could truly exorcise one person without the spirit being able to move onto a new victim beyond our grasp. The results were successful, but disturbing. What about Molly? She has a chance, surely. You know what you're doing. She has a chance. His expression changed a little, displaying just a tinge of regret. She has a chance. In any case, we need you there. It's sometimes useful to have a familiar face, someone the victim recognizes. So, for about 500 years, the church has been transferring the demons from every possessed person they find into one body? Yes, it's called... they call themselves... it's called Pan. How many are there? We have about 1,100 on record. It slowed to a trickle in the last century or two. We'd like to think it's because people are becoming possessed less often, but strong odds are it's a combination of decreased church power and the demons becoming better at hiding from us. If anything, whatever's in Molly must be a particularly witless servant of darkness. I swallowed spit to wet my bone-dry throat. Is the original person, the person from France, are they still in there? If they are, God help them. God help them more than anyone who has ever lived. The older priest walked towards the door, signaling everyone else to follow. He and the younger priest approached the door. They hesitated before swinging it open on tortured hinges. I followed them in, cold lead weighting down in my gut. The room inside was brightly lit by gently flickering fluorescent lights, hanging from the ceiling in old, warped protective cages. The room was a perfect square, and as I write all this, I realize that I'm just putting off having to describe what sat, motionless and slumped over in the center of the room. Its skin was smooth, glistening pink all over, like the sensitive, healing skin that forms over a bad burn. Its frame was emaciated, its skeleton warped and overgrown. It surely would have been at least 7 feet standing up. It had no face, or nothing that could be called a face anymore. Its eye sockets were sunken, depressions, covered in the same raw skin that stretched over the rest of its frame. It had a mouth, lipless, the top and bottom connected by thick fleshy tendons, stretched taut even when its mouth was only half open. The worst part was the bones. Its collarbone emerged into the open air like bony ridges on a pink landscape. Its spine extended up from its bent back like a yellow mountain range, and 6 dead straight horns emerged like a crown from its scalp. After a breathless moment, fighting my urge to bolt and run and fall apart, I noticed the strange texture of the bone, how riddled it was with holes, and how strange the holes looked. My mind resolved what I was seeing all in one sickening instant. The bones were buildings. The collarbones were stepped levels of little houses built onto the bone. Each jutting vertebrae was a tiered palace, like something out of a Bible illustration, and the horns were like Renaissance towers, slender and fluted, ringed with elegant geometric openings. And the openings, the would-be windows and door frames, black wispy things slithered and wrapped around each other, some twisting in the recesses, some straining against the openings, held within by some unseen barrier. I vomited down my shirt. Whether that was out of fear or disgust, I'm still not quite sure. After another dazed moment, I realized that the thing was ringed with tall golden crosses, and it took me another moment to recognize them. Following my eyeline, the older priest whispered to me, "As far as the public knows, every pope uses one pastoral staff. This is a lie. We make 13 identical ones, parade them in front of the faithful to strengthen their anti-demonic properties, and at any given time, 12 are employed here." The two priests moved into the ring of staffs, rising up from the floor. Most of the Swiss guard spread out throughout the room, guns aimed down, but stances ready and defensive. 3 of the guards were putting all their strength into dragging a screaming, senseless Molly across the floor. Her screams had become so piercing it was painful, and she was so desperate to distance herself from the ring of crosses that she wasn't deterred in the least by the crosses being snapped together around the rim of her collar. "Jesus Christ," I shouted, as she was pushed past the threshold. The skin down each of her sides, down the full length of her body, began to burn and blister and sizzle with dripping fat. "It is the only way," announced the old priest. I followed them into the ring. The 3 guards had forced the wailing Molly to her knees in front of Pan. "How?" I asked. "How do you do it?" The young priest answered this time. "There's no special words, no particular incantation. We've got it in a ring it can't escape from. Now we burn it out of the one towards the other." The 2 priests simultaneously pressed their crosses against one of the increasingly rare, unburned parts of Molly's body, the center of her back. She screamed worse than ever before, and I began to hear a bizarre crackling sound. My stomach flipped again as I saw its source. Molly was elongating away from the crosses, held in place by 3 straining guards. It was like her body was trying to grow away from the source of her pain. The center of her chest yawned outwards into a massive mound. Her mouth inched forward into a muzzle, gums and sharpening fangs tearing out and leaving tattered lips behind. It was at this point that Pan apparently woke up. It launched up towards the ceiling, up off its chair to strain against the chains that keep it down. The lights flashed off and on sporadically. The room shook and quaked. No, it wasn't just the room. It was like the air. My insides and the space itself had blurred. Insane seizure where all senses and thought was lost in madness, down to the molecular level. I voided my bladder, my bowels and my stomach, and then I saw Molly, or what had been her, whip around, almost throwing her handlers off their feet. Something black and gaseous and brimming with hate and energy screamed towards me, impacting like a giant hammer and throwing me backwards. And then there was darkness. There was darkness for a long time, but then there was light, faint and growing quickly, forming a tapered oval halo.
"Let me tell you something, little liar. Liar to himself and to others. Let me tell you the way of things. The way of what you've always wanted to understand. What you've always feared an understanding of. There is all, everything that ever was and ever will be, the sum of all existence, and it is a black egg."
What is this? What's happening? You're a demon. The demon who had Molly. You've escaped into me.
Yes, but never mind that. You're going to learn something. I'm going to teach you because you're such an interesting little liar.
The egg's halo glowed a little brighter.
Existence is a black egg. The shell is cold. It is slow and stable and quiet. Slow things live there and have slow thoughts, and there is order there. The world is strange for me to speak, so foreign. Things make sense to the beings within. There are laws, rules. Things are painfully consistent. But inside the egg, inside the black egg, there is red.
I felt myself whipped forwards into the egg in a rush of changing pressure. I slowed and found myself in a scarlet nightmare, red liquid stretching like a bloody ocean in every direction. Strange currents slashed and surged inexplicably in all dimensions. There were structures there, stretching infinitely up, stretching infinitely down, flaring and narrowing. Huge black structures made from shiny bulbs, all held together by hardened ooze. The individual swollen bulbs deformed each other as if they had grown together in competition, some bending and curving around others. Cavities gaped in the swollen sections of the black, organic columns, and things flowed in and out of them. Bulbous things, composed of smaller, clustered black bladders like frog spawn. They stretched to a point at either end. Their surface bristled with rhythmically waving, multi-jointed, thousand-fingered arms and legs that lengthened and shortened impossibly. Some of these were caught and swept along by the insane currents of the vast red ocean.
"In the red,"
came the demon's voice again.
"In the red there is no order, no rules. It is a living place, a warm place, where things flow as they will. And the things that grow here, the life that thrives, they think nothing of salvation."
That last word had come out strange, like it had been sizzled and disintegrated as soon as it had been voiced in such an inhospitable environment.
"Nothing of hope."
That word boiled and simmered just like the last.
"Or goodness."
That word screamed and was swept away almost before it could be heard.
"Because the red is almost all of it. There is so much more inside the egg than that thin shell that surrounds it. And the things that grow and live there understand this. They understand what existence is. A red place of pain and madness, where all things eat all things. Sometimes they abandon their hard forms."
As the voice said this, one of the bulbous creatures popped, rupturing to admit a large black cloud that surged up and away in an instant.
"They abandon their hard forms, go soft and float up to the epiderm. For their hard forms would be too heavy and cumbersome to pull through the barrier. And sometimes they enter the hard forms of the things that live up there. The simple, slow things, the stupid things that imagine there is something better beyond the egg."
I began to see something new. Little white wisps darting back and forth through the endless red. They moved furtively, in fits and starts, like they were scared, like they didn't know where to go.
"And when, in the epiderm, hard forms fail, the things that live there, their soft forms drift down, all the way down into the red."
A number of the black bulbous creatures began to surround one of the little wispy things, penning it and scaring it so that it didn't dare dart out.
"And the creatures of the red do not share in the delusions held by the creatures of the black."
One of the black creatures extended two of its arms and interlocked its 1,000 fingers into a lattice around the white wisp. The white wisp began to shake and vibrate and struggle against the fingers trapped. I could see black sphincters between where all the fingers stemmed from, in the black thing's palms.
"You see that one? That's your mother."
The sphincters yawned open, and fronds of narrow, questing tendrils poured out before seeming to sniff out the white thing, at which point they began lashing towards it. They dug deep into the desperate, thrashing and quivering white thing that began to turn grey, the greyness spreading, crawling across and down into the white thing from the countless points the tendrils were penetrating it. The white and grey thing became more desperate, throwing itself pointlessly against the fingers. Its protest started to become weaker and weaker, as if from an enormous distance I thought I heard screaming. All in an instant, I was whipped back, across immense distances at terrifying speed, and in a moment of collision, I woke into my spasming body. I screamed at a wave of squeezing and burning that bloomed down my right side. As I looked up, I saw the young priest and the old priest alike, bearing down on me with their crucifixes. 2 Swiss guard were holding me down, putting all their weight on me, but somehow, impossibly, one free hand was stretched out, pulling me along against my will, bit by bit, towards the edge of the ring of papal staffs. I could feel it inside me, an immense and dripping black presence pressing out of the back of my head, flattening my entire self and mind and soul against my throbbing eyes. In a moment, all that I had seen, all that the demon had showed me, crystallized, the full weight of it hitting me. But it didn't break me. My mind lashed out against it, going mad with denial, with the need to believe that it was wrong, that there was something else, something outside the egg. From the front of my skull, I pushed back at the bile, pressing it forward, just as I forced my will back into my limbs and launched myself up with strength that wasn't mine. Tossing the guards, pinning me down, away and out of the ring, Pan was still awake, crashing up and down, into and out of its seat in the strobing light. The black, smoke-like masses in its bone cities swelled against whatever force held them inside. I snatched one of the crosses from out of the younger priest's hands, feeling my skin turn to lava around it. I held it up in front of my chest, weathering the agony that cascaded over me as I screamed. Jesus Christ is the one true Savior, Son of the one true God, and he is outside the egg. I felt myself pulled around, a thunderclap sounding all around me as I slammed onto the ground. Something black and gaseous rocketed out between 2 papal staffs, bending them with its passage before hitting the wall with a deafening slap and vanishing, leaving behind a crumbling crater. All the crosses stopped burning me so much, and at last, mercifully, I passed out. They didn't explain a lot during my brief period of physical and mental recovery in the Vatican. Only what I needed to know. The exorcism had been a failure. The demon was at large. This was rare, but not unprecedented. Molly's mother would be kept quiet. The story was, Molly had drowned herself. I had performed admirably, and I was to return to my parish, which at least I did, feeling nothing but hollow and numb. At least the burns had mostly healed. As I closed my front door behind me and turned into the sitting room, I paused a second, so completely unable to identify what I was seeing that there was a delay before I vomited, again, on yet another shirt. There was a mass of gore sitting on my armchair, a senseless fusion of rearing bone, stretched, raw, meat, and occasional bulges covered in black, blood-matted fur. It had limbs, 2 crossed over the edge of the chair, one resting on one of the chair's arms, one holding a glass of whiskey in a dripping claw of exposed sinew and distorted bone. It was only when I looked between the thing's legs that I figured out more or less what it was. I saw Kojak's skinned and now misshaped head, jaws open wide and separated by a number of sharp teeth that had stretched down and fused together, like the joining of stalagmites and stalactites in a cave, and the tongue, the lolling, twitching tongue. There's really no way to say it besides this. It had become a human penis while retaining its original texture. I made a weak, grating sound, my mind blank. The limb holding the whiskey lifted up, pouring some down a stretched gouge of a cavity at the opposite end from Kojak's flayed head. It would take me a long time to figure out that this hole was the gaping ruin of Kojak's anus.
I should say,
came the flooding, suffocating voice of the demon,
that all this, at least, was not intentional. Before coming to the epiderm, I learned how to inhabit human heart forms. When you use the same principles to try to enter a dog, things can get messy.
Get out, I said in a wavering voice. I banished you once, get out.
As if I didn't want to leave that dark hole the liars brought me to. In any case, this whiskey doesn't seem to be working. Doesn't really taste of anything.
I banish you.
Again, I let myself out. Oh, but you got into quite a frenzy, didn't you?
The mass of meat stood up, placing one arm behind its back and holding the whiskey high as it walked, as if deep in thought. I kept moving around to keep the distance between us, but it wasn't trying to walk towards me specifically. Its footsteps were tiny, wet sounds, and the puddles of blood they left behind would quickly drag forward of their own volition, attempting to rejoin the main mass.
You were so spooked, you became a good true liar just for a bit, and screamed the name of your god with such conviction, because in that moment, with the memory of the red so fresh in your mind, you couldn't bear to believe in anything else.
The meat stopped, turning as if to look at me.
But it's been a while, and the fire's burned down to embers. And you don't believe like you did in that moment, no matter what you tell yourself. You've almost gone back to how you were before it all. I can feel it in you.
You're wrong. Jesus Christ is...
We both know I'm not wrong. So shut up about it. So tell me, you've had a little bit of an arc. Had a few moments of the certainty you'd always looked for. But have you finally realized? Has the whole thing given you the context to understand why you joined the liars in the first place? I can see it plain as day, but in all those weeks recovering, have you pieced it together?
I took a deep breath, swallowed, and answered. Because all my life I was scared. Scared that we, the whole world, everyone together, didn't understand anything. That the universe was so big, and death was so long, and we had so few answers about any of them. So I started pretending, or deluding myself into thinking I believed one thing. The thing I was brought up with. I kept telling myself that I believed it because the thought was so much more comfortable and safe than admitting how impossible it was to know the truth. That the kind of things you showed me, or a million other horrible, hopeless things that could be true. And I needed to believe so badly, I did everything to play to the fiction, all the way up to devoting my life to what I was trying to convince myself wasn't a lie. The demon sniggered slightly, in what almost seemed a friendly way.
Well, now you've figured it out, you aren't so fun to watch anymore.
The meat began to walk again, straight towards the wall and up it, casually mocking nature as it continued its stroll up the walls, across scenic paintings, and finally stopped to stand, hanging from the ceiling, directly above the glass globe. The whiskey stayed in the glass.
Just one more thing. One more little spook of a thought. You know now what the epiderm is. How thin it is, how fragile. And you have beings of chaos and destruction at large in it. And you concentrate them all in one pinprick of a point. All that instability and pressure bearing down on one minuscule piece.
My eyes started to tear up, and I was overtaken by a wave of shivering as I started to piece together where the demon was going.
If you keep pushing and trying to put more and more pressure on that one little part of the shell, the spot already so saturated it's getting difficult to add anything more to. If you force that tiny extra bit of stress on such a thin, fragile shell, Well, what do you think might happen?
The meat went limp and dropped from the ceiling, smashing the glass globe into 1,000,000 pieces.
I bought a bag of runes at an estate sale. They were quartz crystal. They had some clarity to them, but were mostly opaque. They were still very beautiful. Sometimes when I held them, they would grow warm and stay warm for hours, but I just assumed it was body heat that would warm them up. I still think that to some extent. I had such good luck for the next 6 to 8 months that I owned them. I found money lying around on the sidewalk several times. I got a $10 pay rise and praise from my bosses, and things were so peaceful at home. I received an unexpected refund check that paid my bills for several months, just lots of little special things. Nothing big like winning the lottery. I was just lucky. Then one day my husband was hurt in an accident at work. Now we know he has a permanent back disability, but at the time all we knew was that he was in pain. At the doctors, they were scrambling to fix neurological damage under his spine so that he wouldn't be paralyzed. He couldn't move his legs for several weeks, but he's able to walk today, if in pain. So I guess that in itself is a little lucky. But one day while he was suffering through those first weeks, I was home scrambling to clean the house, feed our teens, and get back to his side at the hospital. I was suddenly overwhelmed with grief and sat on the edge of my bed to cry when I remembered the stones. I glanced at my bookshelf where I had laid them in a red velvet bag, and they were gone. No explanation. The kids were clueless, of course, nowhere to be found. I later asked my husband, but he remembered nothing about them. Time passed and we were consumed by life, his recovery and rehab, and the work, disability, and finally job loss. It was months before I thought of them again. We lost our house and I was putting things into storage, and then I thought about the runestones again, and I realized our luck had gone south about the same time as the disappearance of them. It may of course have been entirely coincidental, buying the stones and having good fortune, then the subsequent loss of them at the beginning of all the bad luck. I don't really believe in magic, not really, but if acquiring such an item brings short-term good luck, then we paid threefold in pain and suffering when they were lost. All that I know is that I'm not going to buy any occult-related objects again anytime soon. They simply aren't worth the risk.
Perhaps you've heard of Andersonsburg, the old western Pennsylvanian town that, like Roanoke before it, suffered a mysterious end and left no accounted survivors to enlighten anyone as to the details of its fate. Luckily, that may no longer be the case. I've joined a university-funded expedition here and have been tasked with collecting items of value that can hopefully assist in our search for knowledge pertaining to the curious fate of the city. After some exhausting work, I did indeed come across a diary that is, by far, the most informative document yet unearthed. I'll check the contents for veracity at a later date. For now, here are the most relevant excerpts for anyone interested. April 3rd, 1829. Another man caught the fever. This time, down at the lumber camp. From what I heard, the poor bastard was tying down the logs when he just up and fell right over into the river. Almost drowned, I heard. And when the others got to him, Matthew and Thomas and the lot, they said his face had gone pale as a cloud, and that he was shaking and sweating and coughing. Ain't no mistaking that for nothing but the early signs of the fever. So they hauled the poor fellow out and gave him a canteen and had him rest. But then, without telling him, they struck camp and left him there. I'm not sure what came of him, but everyone here knows the mayor's rule. None struck with the fever are permitted to return to Andersonsburg. If they're favoured enough to survive the thing, unlikely as that sounds, they're to remain banished to the woods with nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever coin they've got in their purse. Not a one of the lads down at the camp wanted to risk becoming an infected and meeting such a grisly fate. No, sir. April 4, 1829. By mayor's decree, the lumber camp is to be abandoned, along with all the supplies it's gathered, for fear of being tainted with fever. There was an uproar at the mansion today over the decision. Many men are out of work now because of it, but strange enough, I didn't see not a one of the fellows from the camp itself down at the mansion, just their wives and some others. And I know why too. They wouldn't admit it aloud, no sir, but they don't want to go back. I wouldn't either. I've seen the fever at work at Pinefield, and it ain't got no place in my home. Not while I got a wife at home, no sir. April 7, 1829. Maria says to me today in the kitchen, "Paul, I can't believe the mayor would throw so many good men out of jobs." But I says back to her, "Dunno, sweetheart. Perhaps he's got himself a point. That old camp's been run clear over with fear, and you don't want that plague finding its way around here. No sir. God himself couldn't stop it if it did." So she snorts and walks away, but she'll come round eventually, especially when the stories of the infected keep coming. If fever hits the camp, then it's only a good 2 or 3 miles from town. Only a matter of time, I think, before it finds its way here. God above, I hope I'm wrong. But maybe I should start thinking about taking Maria away for a time though, to see my brother in Philadelphia. Just till all the foul things conclude here. April 11, 1829. A man got shot last night, not 100 yards from Jim Isley's porch. Jim says he was delirious, just stumbling about near the tree line without an aim in the world. He calls out to him as he says, "Declare yourself. You's an Iroquois. I'll shoot you dead if you're an Iroquois, old boy." And he says nothing, so shoot him he did. Then Jim sent his boy Nathan into town to fetch a picket while he watched in the field, thinking an Indian attack was brewing. But when Nathan got back with some of the men and their rifles looking for a good fight, not another Indian had shown his face. So they went out and looked at the body, and saw it was something worse. That old infected fellow from the lumber camp found his way back to town in his stupor, and by God, says the men, the fever worked its way through him right quick. Says he was rotting inside out, skin falling off like a leper, teeth all filed in those wicked points. So they put up their shirts to their noses and mouths, and they set the body to the flame. They told the story today at the pub, but some of the other gents took offense to the tale. Says they should have told the mayor, says they shouldn't have gone near the corpses. One fellow, Tom Higgins, I think he was, said those men were probably infected too, by virtue of going near even a dead infected, says the plague lingers after death. Then he bolts out the door, and the barkeep asks the storytellers to leave. I left too. Ain't no risk in getting the fever, no sir. April 15, 1829. Jim Isley didn't show up at the office today, and all the men there know the story with the infected fellow getting shot too. So the rumours are swirling. No one heard from him. His clients are stopping on by, and all we can say is, we ain't seen the fella. Come on by later on. So they do, but they ain't happy about it, no sir. I like old Jim, even if he's a little small-brained, so I says to myself I'll stop by his house after closing to see what's the matter. I know I shouldn't, but if he's sick, I'll know for sure and I won't go near the man. I just hope it ain't the fever. God above, I hope it ain't the fever. So I gets to his house around about dusk, and his wife opens up the door. She's a sweetheart, she is, but even though she's putting on a nice big smile for her guest, I can tell she's got a worry on her mind. So I put my hat on my chest, and I says, "Greetings, ma'am. Just stopping on by to extend my regards to Jim. he didn't show up at the office today, you see, and I was hoping I could see him." Then her smile faded, and she says, "That's mighty kind of you, Paul, but Jim's been under the weather, and he won't let neither me nor Nathan in the bedroom. Alls I know is he's sweating and having trouble keeping down a meal." Then my smile fades, and I says without a second thought, "Sarah, I'm guessing you heard about the guest a half week back. The man Jim shot?" And she says, "The Iroquois scout? Jim says he shot him dead." So I says, "Sarah, that weren't no Iroquois scout. That was the infected fella from the lumber camp. Jim and some other fellas burned the body once they saw the skin." And her face goes white as a ghost, and she just says, "Don't you lie to me. Don't you lie to me about my Jim." And she goes and shuts the door in my face. I hope she gets her wits about her and gets Nathan out of there soon. He's a good lad, and she's got a big kindly heart herself. They don't deserve this. As luck would have it though, I ran across Dr. Armistead on the way home, and I tells him about Jim. Maybe he can help. April 16, 1829. Maria wakes me up early today, and she says, "The Isleys are gone. The Isleys are gone." And I'm tired, so at first I don't know what nonsense she's talking. But then I remember Jim and Sarah and Nathan, and I says, "What do you mean gone? Dead gone?" And she says, "No, the doctor says Jim's got the fever, Paul." And so a few men grab their muskets and they haul the whole Isley family out of their house and toss them right out of the whole town. Some of the men says if they ever come back, they'll shoot 'em dead. So I feels right guilty for ratting them out, and I throws my covers off and I run outside and down the street. Sure enough, the Isley home's gone up in a smoke. The whole town's out there watching it burn without a pity, except the parish. And when I run up, I hears people talking about anyone else who'd been in contact with the body of the fellow down at the lumber camp. Then I hears the other names come up. David Brodie, John Green, Will Benson Hodges. The townsfolk say they've got to find them and give them the boot, or else the whole town will get the fever. One lass says, "Why don't we just shoot him?" And another fellow says back to her, "Then we'd have to remove the corpse. Wouldn't want to go near such a thing, would you? The plague lingers. Better to have 'em walk right out on their own 2 feet. But I thinks to myself, hell, that's almost worse. April 18, 1829. The town's all done over in a hysteria, I tell you. The mayor's declared martial law, even since the Isleys and the Brodies and the Greens and the Hodges got evicted, and not a soul is to enter Andersonsburg until further notice. You can leave, and he won't stop you, but you ain't coming back if you do, and the townsfolk will assume your departure means you've been struck with the plague. Then they'll burn your home to ashes. I've seen it happen 10 times in the last few days alone. These boys ain't playing games, no sir. There are some of them religious folks talking about how it's God's judgment for sin, and other fellows with muskets patrolling the streets. And every once in a while, you'll hear a big old loud crack as he pops off his gun. 'Cause that's the other thing, you see. Them infected keep trying to get back in. April 20, 1829. Some of the infected stormed in down Mulberry Street last night, stole some cattle, rattled some doorknobs, but the militia showed up right quick and drove them off with some sharp musketry. They didn't kill any of them until they'd run out past the wooden palisades. Then they'd shoot them in the back and dropped them like a sack of potatoes, says they. The men have orders only to wound if possible, you see, if the infected make it inside the town. That seeing as how the dead infected in the streets is like a corpse some poor bastard'll have to remove. And then he's struck with fever too, far as the town's concerned, and they sent him a packing. Needless to say, not a man, woman or child in Andersonsburg willing to volunteer for such a job. So the mayor says to the militia captain, he says, if them infected find their way in here, You get 'em out some way, other than killing 'em dead, you hear? I ain't aiming to have to pick a poor lad to take the bodies out, and take himself out the same way, no sir. April 24, 1829. The mayor let in a visitor today. Some of the townsfolk down at the hall threw up a good fit over that. But the man had something to say, so in he comes. He meets with the mayor, and from what I heard from Phil Gables, he told the mayor the infected have thrown in their numbers and overrun the nearest town over west. That place, Leicesterburg, was in a similar spot to us, rooting out the infected, burning their homes. Barricades had gone up, and militia had been mobilized. All the same, the infected, hungry for flesh, swept in out the woods one night and overran the barricades and the watchtowers, and killed every last person in the town. Except for this fella, Charles Gates or something or other. He was the last man alive, and he ran all the way here to tell us the horde is heading up this way, not 2 days out. So now the town's got to figure out what's to be done. Some people think the fella's lying to get himself a bite to eat. Others think we should all leave Philadelphia while the leaving's good. And others think we can take on the horde. Leicesterburg was half the size of Andersonsburg after all, says they. We have more men, more muskets. We would beat them. But it's all up to the mayor now. April 25, 1829. The mayor elected to stand and fight, but said that anyone who sought to flee was welcome to do so, of course. Got himself a nice round of applause, and then the men, myself among them, said about collecting arms and bullets, and building up the barricades in the streets, and setting up wood towers for the lookouts. If these infected aim to have a fight they shall have. According to Charles, we should expect the horde to come up from the southwest near the pike, sometime in the next 12 or so hours. Said there were uncountable hundreds of them, all rotting away and thirsty for blood and crawling like beasts. We've got ourselves a good 240 men, and muskets and rounds enough for maybe 180 of them. Add to that number 30 good sharpshooting rifles for the marksmen in the towers, and even 2 12-pounders overlooking the pike from 2 angles, and we got ourselves a fine force to defend the town with. But I can see it in everyone's eyes, a mist of fear. Tonight I'll spend the evening with Maria, and we'll do what the 2 of us can to take our mind off things. By the door is my musket, of course, and in my satchel all the ammunition I could find. Should I hear the church bells go off at any point, I'll have no choice but to grab the gun, kiss Maria one last time perhaps, and rush out to the southwest barricade to do some fighting. If the church bells ring a second time though, everyone knows what that means. The infected have broken through. Then it's time to hit the road to Philadelphia. So I tells Maria to keep our valuables packed. April 26, 1829. Today I took a good stroll out on the edge of town. We've got ourselves a good palisade. Some of the boys at the northwestern edge even dug themselves a trench, and the whole of the militia, even Captain Gaines, have elected old Booker Downs to lead the defense, seeing as he fought with the mountaineers in the Indian Wars and got himself some experience. So he rounds up some horses and dispatches a rider to Philadelphia to call up some help, and then 2 more riders with orders to scout out the outskirts of town, one to the west to spot the horde, and the other elsewhere to ensure they ain't coming from nowheres else, and report back what they find no later than that mid-afternoon. So off they all go, and the rest of the lads get back to the job of fixing up defences. By now, we've scrounged up a good 12 more muskets and 40 or so pistols, and every blade we could find. The butcher was kind enough to lend us some cutlery, and in the town armoury, Briggs and I bagged up a few score rusty bayonets and distributed them evenly along the front. We got ourselves an army now, boys. I only hope it lasts the night. Still no word from the scouts. Downs is getting nervous. So he goes and he sends off another 2 riders and says, "You lads go no more than a mile out, you hear? Then come on back to me." So off they go. One of the new scouts came a-galloping on back in, and he's huffing and puffing, and he says to Downes, "They ain't just coming back up from the west, sir. Spotted a good lot of 'em in the northeast too, and the north. And they got themselves horses, a whole mess of 'em." And Downes says, "What do you mean horses? Like they eatin' them?" And the scout says, "No sir, they's riding 'em, like cavalry. Dead-looking things, rotten skin, with the same red eyes as those infected folk. And they making speed, sir. They making damn good speed." And no sooner does he say that, then the church bell rings, and I look up, and all the men looks up. And we see young Johnny Billings up there, and he's waving his arms and shouting something fierce and pointing off to the west. So we looks to the west, and there they are, all of a sudden, a whole mess of them, infected, coming up out of the tree line and running up the hill towards the barricade. So we all rush up to the wall and take aim, and Downes says to fire the 12-pounders. So they fire. And a good few of those infected goes a-flying, but then more are coming, and more, and more. So then the marksmen open fire from the towers, and they're picking the bastards off as best they can. But the hordes get closer and closer. Soon they's in musket range, so me and the boys fire a volley, and when we reload, the boys behind us fire, and then the boys behind them. We 3 lines deep at the choke points, and pretty soon we got infected piling up right quickly, not 50 yards off, dead and more dead and more. But the rest of them keep right on climbing over the pile of dead ones, and keep right on coming, and we keep right on shooting. But then the infected did something I ain't seen yet. Far as I could tell beforehand, the fever keeps you from thinking straight, and then you're just not thinking at all. You just got a mindless thing with rotting skin that eats and kills. But today, after a good 10 or 12 minutes of fighting, the horde got up, and the whole lot of them actually fell back. Now that says to me a number of things. Things discussed openly as the men set about reloading and fetching water in the interim. That means these things are thinking. They knew they couldn't break our lines, and so they retreated back towards the trees. They ain't done. We can still see their damn red eyes glowing through the shroud of trees. But they fell back. Maybe they got scared. The infected haven't tried another all-out assault yet. Commander Downes thinks they's waiting for nightfall so they can slip in unseen. So he had a handful of boys from each of the regiments head out to the killing fields and throw up some lamps while some others stood guard. When sunlight starts to fall, we'll have other boys run out with torches and light those lamps, and the hope is we can keep the fields lit for shooting through the night, and we got closer lamps too that can be lit from behind the barricade without having to send men out all exposed. Sun's coming on down. We can still see them damn infected in the trees, and we hear rustling and footsteps, and Commander Downes says they're likely to be bringing up reinforcements for another push. Billy's got a fine ear, and he says he can even hear 'em talking out there, grunting and stuff, probably planning their next move. Meanwhile, the boys on this side of the palisades have been reinforcing the barriers. Still no word from the other 3 scouts, but we ain't holding our breath on their return. Around about 8 o'clock, we heard some shooting in the northwest barrier, so Commander Downes sends me and Butler and Peyton out to see if they need help. So we get there, and the boys said the things had tried crawling through the tall grass for cover, and were only about 100 some odd feet from the palisade when the boys spotted them and started shooting. So he goes back to Downes and tells him, and he calls up a council of war with the regiment heads, and says that given that and the retreat from earlier, it's clear the infected are smarter than we thought, made a point to say that no weapons could fall into their hands. Not under any circumstances, no sir. No, we all still waiting for that big nighttime push. Sure enough as hell, those infected bastards made a second big charge against all the barricades at the same time, sometime before midnight. Damn near caught us with our pants down, round the ankles too. We hear rifle cracks from the marksmen's towers, and then the 12-pounders fire off, and then a flurry of musket fire from the northwest. Then they hit us twice as hard as they did before, and we're firing volley after volley into them, stacked up 3 lines deep to keep the musket balls flying, and they're hitting the dirt, and bits and pieces of them are flying, but they still keep on coming. Then they start hitting back, even though they're still a good 50 yards to the palisade. They bring up rocks and start flinging them towards us, fistfuls of gravel flying in through the musket smoke. And they peppering the boys and knocking teeth loose. Men start to yelp when they get hit, and them 12-pounders are firing away too. Every couple of minutes, and that tears big groups of them down, but they keep on coming till they was right up at the palisade, and Commander Downs told the front row to start up with their bayonets and blades and tomahawks. I remember how close the bastards came to taking a big old bite out of my neck. Luckily, old Bruce kicked the summer bitch with a bayonet in the head, and he keeled over. Not long after that, the infected retreated again. But now, we got a fresh problem. We got casualties. Men are bit. Men made contact with the plague. And now, we got to do what we all knew we'd have to do. Get rid of the infected. Commander Downs rides up, and he takes a good long look at this one poor lad, arm bleeding from a bite, and he tells him to head out and relight the torches. The boy looked all forlorn, like he knew what was happening. But he weren't about to disobey orders, so out he goes, and as soon as he lights the torch, Downs has one of the men fire on the poor lad. He dropped like a stone, dead before he hit the ground. That one hurt us all, I think. But we wasn't done neither. Some of the old men got touched by fever too, and so me and the rest of the boys backs up and levels some pistols at 'em, and we asks Commander Downs, "What do we do with 'em, sir?" And he says, "You know what we do. We send 'em away." So at gunpoint, we show the men to the gate, and they're begging and they're pleading, but we got no choice. So out they go, and we say we'll fire at 'em unless they get as far away from town as they can. We all knew what was coming, and sure enough, as soon as they got near the woods, infected ran out and dragged 'em in. We all watched till the screaming stopped, and all the bushes quit their shaking. Few of the men here got sick, others cried. I just wrote it all down. God above, I hope Maria's as far from this hell as possible. April 27, 1829. We slept in shifts last night, and luckily there weren't any other attempts by the infected to rush the barricades. But we're tired, the lot of us. Damn hell, we're tired. I'd be amazed if any man got a lick of real rest. We was silent, but we stayed up and we listened good to the sounds of the infected howling out there in the woods. There were thousands of them. It sounded like filling up the whole night sky with the din of their big collective war scream. Lasted for an hour, maybe more. One of the boys nearest me was praying along all night, begging for the good Lord to come down and save us. I asked him to put in a good word for me too. This morning, some of the wives pitched in with medical aid and a big hearty breakfast. So we ate well, and Commander Downs allowed us some time to spend with our families. Maria and I took a nice stroll, but I didn't have much to say. By midday, I was back at the palisade with the other men, and by sundown, we were starting to hear the infected getting riled up again, hearing that awful howling. Downs and his aides were riding back and forth, making sure the walls were good and solid. The cannons reloaded and manned, and the bell tower watch was keeping his eye out. At this time, we got some of the younger boys to run ammo up and down where it's needed. Shooting started. We'll update if possible. God above. God help us. The infected hit us at all sides all at once. Them cannons were firing like mad, and Commander Downs was telling them, "Aim for the trees, aim for the trees." So they did, and after a few rounds they had managed to dam off the entry points and slow down the horde. But it weren't more than a stopgap. Them infected were running through the musket smoke, howling and screaming for food. Some of them were galloping towards the walls, on all fours, and you could see the red of their eyes, like pooling blood. Jim Isley was one of them, and I had to be the poor bastard to put him down, for good. I'm sorry, Jim, truly I am. But they kept right on coming. The boys were firing wildly and chopping and stabbing and screaming, and then Infected was doing the same and trying to mount the palisades. And then, just when there weren't a lick more we could take, we heard some of the men screaming from down south of us. We wasn't aware we were even threatened there, but sure enough, them infected bastards had broken through some of the pickets and were trying to break in through the windows of the houses. So Commander Downs sent me and 5 other gents to go and put a stop to that. We burst in through the houses and stabbed them through the windows and traded shots for rocks over barrels. I got all good and cut up from the exploding glass windows, but I ain't been bit. Not yet. So we put a stop to them coming in that way. But when I got back, I explained to Downs real good that they were gonna try that again sooner or later, and we needed a good force of men to guard up there. Turns out he'd gotten similar reports for the other parts of town though, so we'd have to stretch our lines real thin to cover it all up. But we did what we had to, and by God we held the line all around the town by the skin of our teeth. Some of the men, God above, grown men, they're just crying. They're so damn tired and scared, we all are. But we held the line, by God we did. Ain't a man here that didn't do his duty. April 28 to 29, 1829. Today, the women and children helped us all build a new defense line towards the center of town. Downs says that if we get hit again like we did last night, we'd have these new palisades and trenches to fall back on. I worked with Maria today, digging away. She tended to my wounds too, and we just enjoyed each other's company as we worked. I even got some shut-eye, some real good shut-eye, if not for an hour or two. Then it was sundown again. The boys and I ate up a stew the women cooked up, and then we were off to the palisades. Them wooden posts were beaten and worn too. We knew we couldn't stay for long, and as soon as the howling started from the trees, Commander Downs ordered the 12-pounders to be stripped and rushed to the inner line of defense, so they'd be ready if it gets bad. Or when it gets bad, I suppose I'll say. I made sure to kiss Maria real good tonight, and made her promise to make a good run for it if those church bells rang twice, which now meant the inner line had been breached. She cried and nodded. I wanted to tell her that if she had to run, I'd meet her at Joseph's house in Philadelphia, but alls I could bring myself to say aloud was, "You run straight for Joseph's, you hear? Don't you stop, 'cause Lord," and I'm tearing up writing this down, I don't know if I'll last the night. Hell, I don't know if anyone here will last the night. We at the inner line of defense now. We ain't been hit that hard since the battle started. God above, it was a bloody mess. The rush started off with some infected leaping out of them woods and tackling the lamps into the ground. The glass broke and all the dry weeds go into flame. Soon the fire smoke and the musket smoke made it so we couldn't see a damn thing out there. Alls we could hear were the howling. Must have been 1,000 of the bastards tonight, maybe more. So we'd been shooting for a while and hacking and throwing rocks. And then we heard the commotion up at the other wall, and boy, we knew it weren't no small thing. There were men screaming, and the shooting altogether stopped up there. So we knew they were done for, and Commander Downs rides up to us and says, "The northwest palisade is breached. Fall back to the inner line, fall back." And so me and the boys pick up our guns and beat a fighting retreat down the boulevard towards the inner walls. Then, them infected started pouring over the palisades, and we knew there weren't no throwing them back, not this time. So we gets back to the inner palisades, and we start right up again, shooting and firing those 12-pounders. Boy, and them infected are coming at us from every side now, howling the whole way, burning up, and getting shot all up, but still running at us. Now we got kids in the camp, and I can hear them little lads and lasses putting up a good cry, even over the din of the fight, as I thinks, how's it we ain't seen them little ones off to Philadelphia? How's they still here? Maybe it's because Downs thinks their being here will inspire us, to fight even harder. Anyways, after about a good more hour or two of shooting and stabbing, the horde dwindles a bit, and that's when Briggs sees it. One of them infected, mounted up on a dead horse, looking down on the town from atop the wooded hill north of town. We only saw his silhouette, but those red eyes peering at us through all the smoke and flame. But he's there, right as rain. Briggs points, and we all look, and we gotta catch our breath in our throats. Them infected got themselves a general, from what looks of it. He's just sitting up there, watching his plague runners set the town ablaze. Not too long after that, some sunlight comes up over the church tower, and then the horde falls back. But we don't know how far. We don't know if they's ran back to the trees, or if they's still inside the town, staying in our houses till dark. Downs says we can spare a nobody to go and takes a look. So here we stay, here in the inner palisades by the edge of town, and we wait for nightfall, and that infected upon the horse. April 29, 1829. So I got some sleep this afternoon. Not a whole hell of a lot, but a better amount than none. First thing I did when I woke was help count ammo. We's almost cleaned out, maybe 10 rounds a man. And now, we's only got 70 men or so. And them 12-pounders is almost out too. They only has maybe 12 balls left to shoot between the two of them. And none of the riders have gotten back neither, so we ain't got no reinforcements coming. So Briggs and I, and Peyton, and Short, we goes up to Commander Downs, and we says, "Sir, we almost out of men and ammo, and we got little ones here, sir, and our wives. And the town's all up in flames, sir. There ain't nothing left for us here, not for a one of us. We should make a run for Philadelphia while we still got daylight." But he says back, "I ain't never left the enemy in command of the field. We stay and we fight." And he rides off. Now, I ain't no mutineer. Lord above knows I done my duty, but I ain't aiming to die for the principle of it. Not when I got my Maria here, and no town left to defend. So, I talks to some of the men and women, and lay it out for 'em. And I says, "Look here, boys, we ain't lasting another night, and if we do, what'll come of us in the next one? We gots to get out of here while we still can. The road to Philadelphia is still open, and we still got ourselves enough daylight to get out of the woods and to the open road before nightfall." And the majority of them nod, and we take a vote. The motion to leave is the clear winner. So we get our things, and we tells Commander Downs, "We's leaving, sir. There ain't nothing here left for us, and we ain't aiming to die for a pile of rubble." And he gets red in the face, and he says back, "I'll have the lot of you hanged for treason." And he calls up his boys, about half the men left with their muskets, and he says, "You lot arrest them mutineers, you hear?" And so they advance, and we level our muskets to repel them back. But before any shots are fired, one of the women in the church points down the road heading off to the southeast, and she says, "Look, one of the scouts is riding in." So we all turn and look, and sure enough, old David Benjamin's pulling up into town, and he looks like hell itself. He says, "Water, water," and so we gives him a canteen. And he then says, "I was coming up with the Columnar State Militia from the Midland. All's the help I could muster up. But them infecteds, they're everywhere. All over the road, out in force. I swears they was lying in wait for the lot of us, like an ambush, and they leapt down from the main road and just tore into the poor lads. They didn't have a chance. I'm the only man who made it back. I needs to tell you all that the road to Philadelphia is blocked." So now the whole damn town is in panic. We surrounded by the plague, and there ain't no way out. And not a minute ago, while I was writing this here entry, someone points up to the hill north of town, and they says, "There's the horseman." And we all look, and there it is, that plague rider, eyeing the town with that wicked red stare of his, and that of his horse. And we sees he's got a whole wretched host of other infected riders. And then they started moving right on down the mountains towards us. Then the howling started, and just now, the church bell started to ring. I know it in my bones I ain't surviving this night. They coming at us from all sides now, and I'm holding Maria tight, as she's crying too, and all we can hear is the wailing of the little ones from the church, and the shouts of the boys as they run up to the palisades with their guns, and the wheeling forward of the cannon. So I gave Maria a kiss, and I'm leaving this diary in her possession. I love you, darling. I love you, and I hope you know that. April 29, 1829. Paul has gone off to the Palisades. He's scared. I am too. We all are, but we've got to be strong for the children here in the back of the church. The other women and I have tended to the lot of them since the men fell back to the inner line of defense, which I helped to build, and at least half of them have the fever. Of that I'm now sure. But it no longer matters, does it? They won't live to see themselves be taken by it, and perhaps that's a merciful thing. The shooting has started. The boys are throwing in everything they've got. God bless the lot of them, but I can tell it's not enough. We've but an hour left, maybe less, before the infected make it to the church. The children here have cried themselves empty, and now they're huddling around myself and the other women, and clutching our dresses and burying their faces in our laps. I'm as afraid as any of them, but I can't let them see that. I can't. The church bells are ringing again, and the men just outside. The 30 or so of them left sound exhausted and panicked. I've no idea if Paul is among them. The cannons have long since stopped firing, likely having expended their ammunition. Only periodically do I hear a musket blast. Paul was explaining earlier that they'd nearly run out of bullets last night. I can't imagine they've found many more. I hear galloping now, coming up from the west. It's not the state militia. It's that plague rider. I can hear him. I know it's him. I know it. He commands these beasts. He grunts and shouts, and they listen. They're only a few yards from the church doors. We've hidden the children in the very furthest corner and covered them up with whatever we can find. We told them to stay quiet at all costs, but some of them are infants. They'll cry for their mothers, and when they do, the whole lot of them will be found. It's been several minutes since I heard musket fire, and the last of the shouts from our boys have long since ceased. All I can hear now is the howling, and some of the women in here saying how we should use the pews to barricade the door. But it's hopeless. We all know it's hopeless. All we can do is be strong for the children. But how can I? My home is burnt. My Paul is gone. All our boys are gone. How can I be strong when my strength is gone? The infected have begun hammering away at the church doors and windows. We're surrounded in here. God, Lord, give me strength. Please, Father, give me strength. Just for a little while longer. Just for a This diary was found buried in the rubble of an old church in the centre of Andersonsburg, cradled by a long rotted corpse that appeared to have suffered several blunt trauma wounds along the length of the spine and around the skull. There are multiple other skeletons strewn about the floor of the place, all but one which appeared to have suffered similarly. The other one, an infant's corpse, and one well hidden in the corner, appears to never have suffered a wound at all. It looks instead to have perished of starvation, likely some days after the events described here. Outside the church, of course, is the town itself. It's currently being picked clean by my colleagues and other members of the university, all for research purposes, of course, although I fear black market scavengers will descend like vultures upon the place once word of its existence spreads, and it's in a spectacular state of ruin, mostly from what appears to be fire damage. As for this document, I'm the only person that knows of the existence of this diary. Anyway, hell, I'll update this later. At the moment, I'm being called over to help with one of the interns, who's apparently collapsed and began to convulse. They're probably just dehydrated.
Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I would like to extend a huge thank you to Deadly Cure, who obviously did the brunt of the work here in this video. However, his voice is so wonderful that I thought he'd be the perfect fit for these stories that I really wanted to bring to life. I honestly hope that you enjoyed this video as much as I did. I know I don't do creepypastas very often, and most of you really do come here for the true scary stories, but I hope that you can appreciate that, sometimes there are some really good creepypastas that deserve to be listened to. Don't forget to head on over to Deadly Cure's channel, show him some love. Why don't we try and get him to 1,000 subs? That would be pretty sweet. I think he deserves it after putting in so much effort, and with a voice like that, it's kind of inevitable anyway. Also a huge thank you to the writers of these stories. Thank you for the submission and the wonderful writers who gave me permission to read the stories in today's video. Of course, also an extended thanks to my subscribers who are also patrons and members, names on screen. Thank you so much, guys. You're all amazing, and of course it really helps me out. Well, with that being said, I truly, truly hope you enjoyed today's video. I mean, I had a blast. I love these kind of stories. And if you did too, perhaps we can have some more in future. Let me know what you thought down below. I'd really appreciate that this time round. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.